Rich man leaves his wife for a younger woman, but life has a different plan for him. Will it be too late to make things right? David stood by the large bay window of their luxurious penthouse, looking out over the city skyline. The golden hues of the setting sun bathed the room in a warm, almost ethereal light, but his gaze was distant, unfocused. He hadn't felt this indifferent in years. For years, Martha had been his anchor, his partner through every hardship, every setback, and every victory. She was the quiet strength behind his success, the woman who believed in him when no one else did. But as his wealth grew, so did his ego, and somewhere along the way, he began to believe he deserved more. More than her, more than the woman who had stood by his side in sickness and in health. Martha, David's voice was steady but cold as he turned to face her. She stood in the doorway of their home, her face pale, her eyes searching his with a look of confusion that quickly shifted to dread. "I'm leaving you." The words hung in the air like a curse, heavier than any argument they'd ever had. She froze, her body trembling slightly. For a moment, there was silence, an abyss between them that neither had ever anticipated. "Why?" Her voice cracked as she took a hesitant step toward him. The pain in her eyes was palpable, a wound too deep for any words to heal. "Because I need more, Martha. I need someone younger, someone who understands a new me. Sophie gives me that." David watched as the color drained from her face, as her world, their world, crumbled in an instant. Martha had always known him as the man who struggled to make ends meet, but this was a version of David she didn't recognize. This was a man who could throw away the love and loyalty of a lifetime for something shallow. And as the realization sank in, a devastating sense of finality took hold of her heart. Martha stood in the middle of their once shared home, the weight of David's betrayal crashing over her like a violent wave. She couldn't breathe. Her chest felt tight, and her mind was spiraling, grasping at anything to make sense of the situation. For years, she had given everything, her dreams, her time, her very self, to support him, to help him climb the ladder of success. And now, she was being discarded as if she had never mattered. She sank to the sofa, her hands trembling as she clasped them in her lap, staring blankly at the floor. The room was eerily quiet, the air thick with the absence of his presence. The life they had built together felt like a distant memory, slipping away with every breath she took. The years of sacrifice, the quiet support, the late-night talks, they all seemed meaningless now. Her mind raced, memories flooding her thoughts in a haze of grief. What had gone wrong? What had she missed? Was she not enough? The questions echoed in her mind, each one more painful than the last. But amid the chaos of her emotions, there was a quiet whisper, one that she couldn't ignore. "You are enough," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. The tears came then, not in a sudden flood, but in a slow, steady stream that seemed to cleanse the deepest parts of her soul. She didn't know what the future held or how she would move forward, but one thing was certain. She could no longer define herself by David's choices. She had to find a way to rebuild, to rediscover who she was outside of him. For the first time in years, Martha allowed herself to feel something other than the ache of loss. A flicker of determination ignited deep inside her, barely visible but strong enough to push her forward. The days that followed were a blur. Martha moved through life like a ghost, her once bright eyes now shadowed with grief and disbelief. The reality of David's departure settled over her in waves, each one more suffocating than the last. The silence in the apartment was deafening. The empty space where David's laughter and presence used to be now felt like a gaping wound. But amidst the pain, a part of her wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, to fight for what was hers, for what they had built together. She wanted to tear apart the illusion of his new life, to make him see the mess he had left behind. But all of that felt pointless. David had made his choice, and now, she was left to pick up the shattered pieces of her heart. It wasn't just the loss of him. It was the loss of everything she had believed in. The person she had sacrificed so much for. The man she had devoted her life to had turned out to be a stranger. and that hurt more than the empty bed beside her. But the pain, though raw and all-consuming, began to shift. Slowly, very slowly, Martha started to pull herself from the wreckage. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick. There were moments when the grief threatened to pull her under, when she felt too small, too insignificant to face the future alone. But as each day passed, something inside her began to stir, a quiet strength, a whisper of resilience she had never fully recognized in herself. She found herself standing before the mirror one morning, staring at the woman who had once stood beside David. This woman, the one who had been overlooked, ignored, and discarded, was still there, still capable, still worthy, and that woman was going to find a way to thrive without him. Martha sat in her small, quiet kitchen, a cup of tea cooling in front of her. The morning light filtered softly through the window, casting long shadows across the table. She hadn't been able to bring herself to open the blinds for weeks. It was as if shutting out the light would somehow shield her from the world. But today something felt different. She had spent enough time crying, enough time mourning the life she thought she'd have. Now it was time to move forward. She reached into the drawer where she used to keep her journals, the ones she had abandoned long ago, before her life had been overtaken by the demands of David's ambitions. There, at the bottom of the drawer, was a small notebook, a relic from her past. It was filled with ideas, dreams, and sketches for a small business she had once dreamed of starting. It had been something she and David had discussed briefly, a life outside the pressure of a success, a world where she could stand on her own 2 feet. But life had gotten in the way. David had gotten in the way. She had buried her dreams beneath his expectations, his need for constant validation, his relentless pursuit of more. As she flipped through the pages, reading the words she had written with such hope and passion, a thought crossed her mind. What if I still could? The idea bloomed, tentative at first, like a fragile seed breaking through the earth. What if she could build the life she'd always wanted? What if she could become someone other than David's wife? Someone who didn't need to be defined by anyone else's expectations. Martha set the notebook down with a quiet resolve. The first step was the hardest, but she was ready to take it. The first days of her new life were filled with uncertainty, and Martha felt as though she was walking on uneven ground, unsure of her next step. Every decision, no matter how small, felt like a mountain to climb. She spent hours researching, poring over business plans, and asking questions to friends who had started their own ventures. Yet, despite the confusion and the overwhelming fear, there was a small flicker of something else, a sense of purpose that had long been buried beneath the weight of her marriage. She often found herself in the quiet moments, sitting at her kitchen table, staring at her notebook, her mind spinning with ideas. Some felt foolish, others too ambitious for someone who hadn't worked for herself in years. But something deep inside her kept pushing her forward. The hardest part wasn't the work. It was the loneliness. She would hear about David's success with Sophie, the way he would show off his new life on social media, posting pictures of them at exclusive parties and glamorous vacations. And though she had long stopped looking, there were times when she still felt the sting of seeing him smile with someone else, someone who had taken her place. But then Martha would remember something. She would remind herself that she wasn't starting from scratch. She was starting from experience. Years of being at David's side, of learning the ins and outs of running a business, of managing people. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into their marriage with only dreams in her eyes. She was someone stronger now, someone who had seen how fragile everything could be. One afternoon, as she stood in a small local market, picking out fresh produce, a realization struck her. She was building something for herself, something no one could take away. The tears that filled her eyes weren't from sadness, but from a new kind of gratitude. She had begun again, and that was more than she could have hoped for just weeks ago. Martha's small business started slowly, at first just a trickle of clients, then a steady flow. She sold handmade crafts and art from local artisans, bringing a touch of authenticity to the fast-paced world of online retail. It was nothing like the high-end world she had once known with David, but it felt real, grounded, personal, and deeply fulfilling in ways she hadn't anticipated. Each new order was a reminder of how far she had come, Each email from a satisfied customer was a small victory. She wasn't just rebuilding a life. She was creating a future on her own terms. Still, the shadow of her past lingered, but each day it grew smaller as she built a new identity. It wasn't just about the business. It was about her transformation. There were moments when Martha would look in the mirror and wonder who she had become. She had gone from the dutiful wife, standing by her husband's side through every triumph and failure, to a woman carving out a new life, learning to trust herself again. One night, after a particularly successful event where she had sold out her entire stock of handmade jewelry, Martha found herself walking home in the cool night air. She stopped for a moment and glanced at her reflection in a shop window. The woman staring back at her was no longer the woman who had been abandoned in her prime. She was stronger, more self-assured, and yes, happier. For the first time in months, Martha smiled. It wasn't a smile of pride or arrogance, but a quiet, knowing smile. She was building something worth having. And maybe, just maybe, she was becoming the person she had always meant to be. Success came slowly but steadily. Martha's small business, born from nothing but her own will and resilience, began to grow. Yet, with every triumph came moments of self-doubt. She would wake up in the middle of the night, her mind racing with fears of failure. Was this enough? Was she truly capable of sustaining this new life? The memories of her marriage still haunted her, sometimes as quiet whispers, other times as sharp, sudden flashes of pain. There were days when she would look at her business and wonder if she had made the right choice. Had David been right all along? Was she meant to just support him, to fade into the background of his grand plans? But then, she would hear from a customer or receive a message from a friend who was proud of her. Those little affirmations felt like life buoys in a stormy sea. Slowly, she began to recognize them for what they were. Proof that she could do this, not just for herself, but for all the women like her who had sacrificed their dreams for others. One late afternoon, as Martha sat in the corner of her store, sipping coffee, a new wave of doubt crashed over her. She had just received an email from her old lawyer's office, the one who had handled her divorce. There was a mention of an asset distribution that hadn't been finalized. The terms, the clauses, everything David had left her with, suddenly felt like an anchor tied to her feet. Was it really over? Was there still a part of her life, her past, that could still pull her down? Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. It was an invitation to a charity gala David and his new partner were hosting. Martha froze. The invitation wasn't meant for her. It was meant for a woman who had been discarded and forgotten. A woman who no longer had a place in that world. Yet, something stirred within her. A quiet, unexpected resolve. She wasn't going to be the woman who lingered in the past, clinging to what she couldn't change. She was done with that. The life she was building wasn't about competing with David or proving him wrong. It was about something far more important, proving to herself that she was worthy of all the good things coming her way. The gala was everything Martha had expected. The glitzy ballroom, the polished faces, the whispers of old acquaintances. Everyone was there, just as they had been in her life before the pain, before the betrayal. But tonight, she didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like someone who belonged. David's new partner, Sophie, smiled at her across the room. Martha could see the faint tension in her eyes, the awkwardness of being with someone who had once shared this life. It was the kind of tension that reminded Martha of the woman she used to be, the woman who had been silent and invisible, not daring to ask for more. She had been David's shadow. But now, standing there among the guests, Martha realized that the shadow had long since faded. She had become her own person, not defined by anyone else's expectations. As she glanced around the room, she noticed how the guests interacted with her. No longer the overlooked spouse, but a woman they respected, admired, and even sought out. At that moment, Martha's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from her best friend, Eliza. "You're doing it, Martha. You've already won." For the first time in years, Martha let go of the past. She looked at David, who was deep in conversation with someone across the room, his new life surrounding him. And instead of bitterness or longing, she felt only peace. She wasn't looking to get back to what they had. She wasn't even looking to prove anything anymore. She was here, in this moment, in this life, because she had chosen it. And that was enough. Martha's business continued to grow, but with each passing day, the weight of her success began to feel heavier. It wasn't the customers or the work itself. It was the expectations. She had started this journey for herself, to find her own path, but now that path seemed to stretch out endlessly before her, full of promises and pressures she hadn't anticipated. Late one night, as she sat at her desk, her mind swirling with numbers, projections, and emails, Martha felt an overwhelming wave of exhaustion crash over her. She realized that she had been pushing herself harder than ever, trying to build something she could be proud of. But in doing so, she was slowly losing the person she had fought so hard to become. There was no time for herself anymore. No quiet moments to reflect or enjoy the success she had earned. She had become so focused on climbing higher that she had forgotten to pause and take in what she had already accomplished. Sitting back in her chair, Martha closed her eyes, letting the silence of the night wash over her. She thought of the mornings when she used to sit by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the world come to life. She missed those moments of stillness, those moments of peace. She hadn't given herself the luxury of rest in months. The phone rang, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a client, one of the major partnerships she had been trying to secure for weeks. They had agreed to move forward with her proposal. The deal would be a game changer for her business. But as the words sank in, a deep sense of emptiness crept in. Was this success really what she had been working toward? Or was it just another way of filling the hole David had left in her heart? She put down the phone, leaning back in her chair again. For the first time in a long time, she didn't know the answer. But she knew that whatever she chose next, she couldn't let this journey consume her the way her past had. Martha had always prided herself on her ability to keep going, to push through when life felt unbearable. But tonight, as she stood in front of the full-length mirror in her bedroom, she saw something she hadn't seen in years: herself. Not the wife, not the ex-wife, not the businesswoman, but the woman she had once been before the weight of everything had settled on her shoulders. She stared at her reflection, searching for the spark she had lost, the fire that had once driven her. The woman looking back at her was familiar, but somehow different. Her eyes were tired, her shoulders heavy with the burden she had carried for so long. But there was something else, too, something deeper, hidden beneath the exhaustion. "You've come so far," she reminded herself. She wasn't the same woman who had watched her world crumble around her. She wasn't the woman who had clung to a love that wasn't meant to last. Martha took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs. She wasn't going to let her past define her any longer. The pain of her marriage, the betrayal, the loss, those things would always be a part of her. But they didn't have to control her future. She reached for the bottle of perfume David had once given her on their anniversary, a gift that had been tucked away in the back of her closet for years. It had always reminded her of him, of their life together, but tonight it felt like something she needed to reclaim for herself. She sprayed it gently, allowing the familiar scent to envelop her. This wasn't about David anymore. This was about her. And in that moment, she saw herself with new eyes. Not as someone who had been left behind, not as someone who had been discarded, but as a woman who had survived. A woman who had fought her way back from the darkest place she'd ever known. And for the first time, Martha was proud of the reflection in the mirror. Martha hadn't spoken to David in months, not since that last interaction at the gala. She'd let him go, convinced that their chapter was closed, that her life had moved on. But despite her newfound independence, there were still moments when the past crept up on her like a shadow, quietly but persistently. It was the little things, a song on the radio, a shared memory with a friend, the scent of rain on the pavement, that would pull her back, if only for a second, to a time when she and David had been inseparable. One late afternoon, as she walked through the busy streets of the city, her phone buzzed in her bag. She almost ignored it until the name flashed on the screen. David. Her heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't expected this. Not now, not after everything that had happened. But there it was, his name staring back at her, pulling her in like gravity. Her thumb hovered over the screen, torn between answering and letting it go to voicemail. For a long moment, she hesitated. She had been so strong, so sure of her decisions. She didn't need him. She didn't want him. Yet, in the pit of her stomach, a flicker of curiosity tugged at her. What could he possibly want after all this time? With a steadying breath, she answered the call. Hello. There was a long pause on the other end before David's voice came through, softer, quieter than she remembered. Martha, it's me. I need to talk to you. Her mind raced. What could he possibly say that would matter now? She had rebuilt her life. She wasn't looking for closure from him anymore. But despite herself, a part of her wondered if there was something in his voice that hinted at regret. Was this truly a plea for reconciliation or something else? David's words hung in the air like a storm about to break. He apologized for the pain he had caused, for the years of neglect and selfishness. He spoke of how everything in his life had unraveled since their divorce. The glamorous new relationship, the business failures, the growing distance from friends and family. Nothing had gone the way he had imagined. I was so blinded by the idea of wanting something more, something new, David confessed, his voice thick with regret. I didn't realize until it was too late. What I had with you, what we had was everything. And now it's gone. Martha stood there in the middle of the crowded street, her body frozen. The world seemed to blur around her. The echoes of his words felt both foreign and familiar. For so long, she had believed that his betrayal was unforgivable, that his choices had destroyed their love beyond repair. And yet, hearing him like this, broken, vulnerable, there was a part of her that softened. She had wanted this apology, hadn't she? She had wanted him to see her pain, to understand the cost of his choices. But now that it was happening, she wasn't sure what to do with it. Could she forgive him? Would that mean opening herself up to the same heartache again? A sharp pain bloomed in her chest as the weight of the years between them settled. She had done the hard work of healing. She had found herself again, rebuilt herself from the ruins of their marriage. And yet, in his voice, there was an undeniable truth. David had never stopped loving her. But did that love still matter? Or had it come too late? Martha, I'm so sorry, he repeated, as if that was enough to make up for everything. But she knew it wasn't. She had learned long ago that words, no matter how sincere, couldn't undo the past. I think you've said enough, Martha replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside. But I've already moved on, David. I'm not that woman anymore. She ended the call without another word, the silence of the city streets settling around her like a finality. She wasn't going back. Not for him. Not for anyone. But as she stood there, the weight of his apology still heavy on her chest, she realized that sometimes forgiveness wasn't about the other person. It was about freeing yourself. Martha hadn't expected the conversation with David to affect her so deeply. It had been years since she'd allowed herself to truly feel anything for him, and yet, hearing the rawness in his voice brought back a flood of memories, some painful, others tender, like the feeling of her hand in his during their first dance. Those moments, once so vivid, now seemed like a lifetime ago. That night, as she lay awake in bed, the silence of the room felt oppressive. The city lights outside her window cast long shadows on the walls, but it was the quiet inside her that felt the heaviest. She'd closed that chapter of her life, told herself 100 times that David was part of a past she could never return to. Yet now, with his voice echoing in her mind, it all felt uncertain. She could still hear his apology, as though it was lodged somewhere deep in her chest. It wasn't just his words. It was the quiet desperation behind them. A part of her wanted to believe that he meant it, wanted to believe that his regret was sincere. But the truth was harder to confront. Even if he was sorry, it didn't change what had been lost. It didn't change the years she had spent rebuilding herself, fighting to reclaim her life after his betrayal. Martha sighed, rubbing her eyes as if that would erase the weight of the night. She had worked so hard to build something for herself, something that didn't depend on David's validation or love. And yet, his confession left her questioning everything. Had she truly forgiven him? Or had she simply pushed him so far out of her life that she no longer had the emotional bandwidth to care? She wasn't sure what was worse, feeling nothing at all, or feeling the lingering ache of a love that had once meant everything but was now nothing more than a ghost. As the hours stretched on, Martha's mind drifted to the woman she had become. She'd made peace with her past. But was peace enough? Was that what she really wanted? Just peace? Or was there something more waiting for her if she could allow herself to believe in love again? The questions lingered long into the night, unanswered but not forgotten. The next morning, Martha's routine felt almost mechanical. She woke up, showered, and dressed for work, her thoughts still lingering on David's call, like a cloud hovering just above her head. She told herself she was done with him, that his words were nothing more than a fleeting moment of guilt. She had moved past that version of herself, the woman who would have clung to the hope that David might return, that their love could be salvaged. But as she prepared for her meeting at the office, something inside her began to shift. She could feel a subtle change, like a door creaking open after years of being locked shut. Was she truly done with him? Or was she just afraid to face the truth of what she still felt? The moment of clarity came unexpectedly as she sat down at her desk, sorting through paperwork. A simple, quiet realization washed over her. She was still afraid. Afraid of what it would mean to allow herself to be vulnerable again. Afraid of losing herself in someone else's love. Afraid of repeating the mistakes of the past. But more than that, Martha realized she was afraid of not knowing how to move forward. She had spent so long rebuilding her life, focusing on herself, that the idea of opening her heart again seemed almost impossible. How could she trust herself to love when she had learned to guard her heart so fiercely? Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from one of her closest friends, Claire. "Hey, I know you've got a lot on your plate right now, but you deserve a break. Come to dinner tonight. We'll talk. No business. No pressure. Just you, me, and some wine." Martha smiled, the tension in her chest loosening ever so slightly. Claire had always been there for her, through every hardship, every triumph. She was the friend who had helped her through the darkest days, the one who never let her forget that she was worthy of happiness, no matter what had happened in the past. Martha typed a quick reply, "I'll be there." "Thanks, Claire." As she sent the message, a small but significant shift took place within her. She didn't need to figure everything out today. She didn't need to solve every question, every lingering doubt. She just needed to take one step at a time, one moment of clarity at a time. Maybe, just maybe, she was ready to stop being afraid, to take the risk of moving forward, not because of what David had said or done, but because she was ready to choose her own path, without looking back. Dinner with Claire was supposed to be an escape, but as Martha sat across from her friend, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The warm, inviting atmosphere of the restaurant seemed to magnify the tension in her chest. Claire, ever the attentive friend, noticed the change in Martha's demeanor immediately. "You're thinking about him, aren't you?" Claire asked, her voice gentle but direct. Martha sighed deeply, stirring her wine absent-mindedly. She wasn't sure where to begin. There was so much to untangle in her mind, but even more in her heart. "I don't know, Claire. It's like I'm trying to close a door that keeps opening again." David's call. It was like he knew exactly how to reach me. I thought I was done with it all, that I could just move on without looking back. But now, I feel stuck. Claire leaned forward, her eyes soft with understanding. "You don't have to have all the answers tonight. You've been through so much already, Martha. It's okay to feel confused. You're not the same person you were when you were with him. You've changed. You've grown." Martha nodded slowly, absorbing Claire's words. It was true. The woman sitting here now, at this table, wasn't the same woman who had once cried herself to sleep over David's betrayal. She had rebuilt her life, piece by piece, like a mosaic of strength and resilience. And yet, in the quiet moments, the past crept back in like an unwanted visitor. "I don't know if I want him back, Claire. I don't know if I can even forgive him fully," Martha admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "But what if I'm holding on to something that doesn't even matter anymore? What if by not letting go, I'm just tying myself to something that's already gone?" Claire reached across the table, her hand warm and reassuring. "The question isn't about what he wants or needs. It's about what you need, Martha. You don't owe him anything, not after what he did. But forgiveness, true forgiveness, it's not for him. It's for you. It's about releasing the power he has over your heart. Martha felt a lump form in her throat as she absorbed her friend's words. For the first time in what felt like forever, she considered the possibility that letting go wasn't about erasing her past. It was about reclaiming her future. The next few days felt like a blur. Martha had been busy at work, focusing on the expansion of her business, but her thoughts constantly returned to that conversation with Claire. She'd spent so many years thinking that forgiveness meant reconciling with David, that letting go meant opening the door for him to come back. But now, she was beginning to see it differently. Forgiveness wasn't about him at all. It was about her. It was about freeing herself from the hold he still had on her, even from a distance. Every time she thought of him, every time she felt the pang of regret or longing, it was like she was giving him another piece of her heart, pieces she could never get back. That night, as Martha sat at her desk, she took a deep breath and reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, but this time, she wasn't looking for a message from David. Instead, she opened her notes app and began typing. I forgive you, David. Not for you, but for me. I forgive you for breaking my heart, for making me feel like I wasn't enough. But most of all, I forgive myself for staying in something that didn't value me. I forgive myself for believing that love should come at the cost of my own worth. The words were raw, but they felt like a weight lifting off her chest. With each sentence, she felt the tightness in her heart ease just a little bit more. She didn't need to send a message to him. The forgiveness wasn't for him. It was for her own peace, her own closure. For the first time in years, Martha felt like she was standing on the edge of something new, something unknown, but full of possibility. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that whatever it was, it would be hers to shape. And that was enough. As the night stretched on and the city lights twinkled outside her window, Martha realized something she hadn't allowed herself to believe in a long time. She was enough, just as she was. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across Martha's apartment. She was sitting by the window with a cup of tea, staring out at the busy city streets below. Everything felt like it was in motion. People hurrying to work, cars honking in the distance. But for some reason, it all seemed distant, as though she was looking at life through a glass wall. The decision she'd made to forgive David felt monumental in the moment. But now, as time passed, the weight of it was starting to sink in. It wasn't just about letting go of him. It was about confronting the years of emotional scars she'd carried. It was about undoing the damage that she'd allowed to accumulate over time. Her phone buzzed, and for a fleeting moment, her heart skipped a beat. But it wasn't David. It was Claire, asking if she wanted to grab lunch later. Martha let out a small breath of relief, and with a sense of defiance, she turned the phone face down on the table. She wasn't going to let herself fall back into the pattern of expecting messages from him, of wondering if he was thinking about her. She had spent so many years in that mental limbo, where the past had a hold on her, preventing her from fully moving forward. But today, something was different. She had finally broken free, even if it was just a small step. The phone buzzed again, and Martha instinctively reached for it. Her heart dropped when she saw the name on the screen, David. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the answer button. It had been weeks since they last spoke. A part of her had wondered if he'd try to reach out, but that didn't make it any easier. She had forgiven him, yes, but forgiveness didn't mean she had to let him back into her life. It didn't mean she had to let him undo all the progress she'd made. She knew that if she answered, she'd be pulled back into the same cycle of doubt and heartache. With a shaky breath, Martha let the call go to voicemail. She couldn't afford to go back, not now, not after everything she had worked through. She stood up, feeling the heaviness of the decision pressing on her chest, but she also felt a glimmer of pride. This time, she had chosen herself. Martha was standing in her new office, a space she had designed herself, free from the constraints of the past. It was still a work in progress, but it was hers. The walls were bare, waiting to be filled with memories of her new life. It felt strange, this sense of starting over, but also strangely liberating. She was no longer the woman who had stayed silent for years, who had put everyone else's needs before her own. No, she had evolved into someone more resilient, someone who knew her worth. It wasn't about proving herself to David or anyone else. It was about proving to herself that she could thrive without depending on anyone's validation. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text. She glanced at the screen, expecting to see the usual notifications. But this time, it wasn't David. It was a message from her business partner. "We've got a big client on board. This could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for." Martha's heart surged. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The culmination of everything she had worked for. The proof that she was more than just someone's wife or someone's ex. She was a force to be reckoned with, a woman who could stand on her own. And yet, a small voice inside her whispered, "What if you still miss him?" She shook her head, dismissing the thought. She had spent so many years wondering what he wanted, what he needed. It was time to focus on what she wanted. She was done looking backward. Martha took a deep breath and sent a quick reply to her partner, confirming the meeting. She would be ready. The future was hers to shape, and for the first time in years, she felt excited about what was to come. As she walked away from the window, the bright light of the city below filled her with hope. It was a new chapter, and this time, she was in control. David stood outside her apartment building, looking up at the window where Martha used to sit, staring into space. The sight brought back waves of memories, moments of laughter, quiet nights in front of the fire, the shared joy of building a life together. Yet now, the distance between them felt insurmountable, not just in miles, but in the years of mistakes he had made. He had tried for weeks to ignore the gnawing emptiness inside of him, but it was impossible. He had everything: money, success, and a glamorous partner who, to his surprise, had left him just as easily as she had come. She was gone, off to find someone more secure, someone who could fulfill the emptiness inside her too. The realization hit him harder than any loss before. He had left the one person who truly cared about him, only to find that what he thought he wanted had turned into an even greater void. David's phone vibrated in his hand, and for a moment, he hoped it was Martha. But it wasn't. It was just another meaningless call, a reminder that his world, once so full, was now defined by solitude and regret. His eyes fell on the building again. He could feel the weight of his actions pressing down on him, suffocating him. He had betrayed her. No more than that. He had betrayed the love they had shared, the sacrifices she had made, the trust she had placed in him. And now, standing here, he understood just how irreversible his choices had been. There was no going back to what they once had. The future he had imagined with Martha was lost, consumed by his arrogance and pride. The pain of knowing that he had destroyed something irreplaceable filled him, and for the first time, David allowed himself to cry. He let the tears fall, not for himself, but for Martha, because he knew she was stronger than he had ever been. She had moved on, and he, stuck in the ruins of his own making, would never be able to undo the harm he'd caused. Martha stood at the front of the room, her eyes scanning the crowd that had gathered to celebrate her business's success. This was her moment. The clients she had fought so hard to impress were finally here, and her efforts had paid off. She could feel the pride swelling within her, and a deep sense of gratitude for how far she had come. But as she greeted the guests, her gaze drifted toward the door. He had arrived. David. Her heart stilled for a moment, her breath catching in her chest. He looked different, worn, almost unrecognizable. His expensive suit seemed out of place, his once confident posture now hunched, as if carrying a weight only he could feel. She could see the pain in his eyes, the regret he had never been able to hide. He approached her slowly, hesitating as though unsure of whether he had the right to even be in the same room as her. "Martha," his voice cracked, and for the first time in a long while, she saw the man she had once loved, not the businessman who had betrayed her, but the man who had been her partner in life. I've made so many mistakes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Martha cut him off, not with anger, but with a quiet strength that left him breathless. "You've made your mistakes, David," she said softly, her eyes steady. "But so have I. I'll let you destroy me for a long time, I let you make me feel small when I should have been proud of who I am. She paused, allowing the words to sink in. I forgave you, but that doesn't mean I want to go back. I'm not the same person I was when we were together. I'm not waiting for you to save me anymore. I've saved myself. David's eyes filled with tears, the weight of her words crushing him. He had hoped, naively, that she might still feel something for him, but the reality of her strength hit him hard. She wasn't the woman he had discarded. She had become something he couldn't even recognize, something far beyond the broken woman he left behind. Martha took a deep breath and then, with a look that could pierce through any pretense, she said, I wish you well, David. I hope you find what you're looking for, but it won't be with me. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was deafening, yet somehow, it was filled with a quiet understanding. Martha had moved on, not out of spite, but because she had learned that her happiness wasn't tied to his choices. David nodded, tears streaming down his face as he turned away, knowing that the door to their past had finally closed. As he left the room, Martha watched him go, feeling no anger, only a bittersweet sorrow. She had loved him once, but she loved herself more now. And as the night wore on, with laughter and conversation filling the air around her, Martha realized that the life she had rebuilt was more beautiful than anything she had ever imagined. Her journey had been painful, yes, but it had led her here, stronger, freer, and more alive than ever before. And for the first time in a long while, Martha knew that her future was hers alone to shape. In the end, we are reminded that true love isn't about what we gain, but what we give. And sometimes, the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go. Martha's journey proves that healing comes not from waiting for someone else to fix us, but from finding our own strength to rebuild. Now, think for a moment. How many times have we held on to the wrong things, thinking we couldn't live without them? If you found yourself moved by Martha's transformation, or if you felt David's pain of regret, we want to hear from you. Leave a comment. Share this story with those who need a reminder of their own strength. And don't forget to like this video. If this story touched you as it touched us, subscribe now, because true stories of transformation and growth are just getting started.